Good evening. At this time of year, we had a little debate about whether it's evening or afternoon. At this time of year when it's getting darker sooner, I'm never know quite what to say, but I'm going to say good evening to all of you. And welcome. My name is Maura Farrelly, and I chair the American Studies program here at Brandeis. Thank you. And I actually used to work in front of a microphone all the time, but I'm not terribly comfortable in front of one. So I'm going to turn it over to our President Leibowitz as soon as I can. But first, I do need to say a few words about the people who made this possible. And then I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the kind of format that we're going to have for the evening, and then I'll turn it over to President Leibowitz, who will introduce our guests. So to begin with, it pleases me beyond measure that we've had to use up some of the extra seats. That means we have fantastic turnout, and that is due in no small part to the work that some of our co-sponsoring departments and programs and institutes did for me. And so I do want to mention them specifically: the Department of African and African American Studies, the English Department, the Politics Department, the program in Religious Studies, the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism, and the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life. So thank you to all of those groups. And then also this turnout is a consequence of our communications office, who did a great deal of work at my request, and so I want to thank you all for that as well. I have two alums whom I want to name. The first one is Sam Weissman, who got his Master's in Fine Arts from Brandeis in 1973. Mr. Weissman made an ongoing gift to the American Studies program, and that gift is the reason we are going to be able to film this event this evening and then make it available online for a number of people who have sent me emails. Some of them are Brandeis alums. One of them is a woman in Oregon who is simply a fan of you two, who emailed me and wondered if she'd be able to watch it online. So thanks to that gift from Mr. Weissman, we're going to be able to do that. It's my understanding also that these lovely plants that Elisa Searle has made available for us are also as a consequence of that gift. And the plants are helping to make for a nice warm environment here. And then the second alum that I need to thank, and he is here, and I don't know where he is, but his name is Mr. Kent Lawrence. He is the class of 1966. A friend of mine, where is he? He's over there. He's somewhere. He's hiding over there. He is. There he is. A friend of mine named Josh Bandock, who was working for the Institute for Humane Studies at the time, put me in touch with Kent, and as a consequence of that, Kent generously funded initially a supper club that we ran in the American Studies program last year, where I and 7 students got together and we read some primary source documents from the American founding, and we had dinner at 5 restaurants in Waltham. And that's how I got to know Kent. And then as a consequence of the relationship that I was able to build with him, and his generosity and his own commitment to liberal learning, we are now able to bring Professors George and Professors West to Brandeis. So, as far as the format is concerned, President Leibowitz is first going to introduce our speakers, and then they are going to speak to us, and I imagine to one another, for a little less than an hour or so. And then I may have a question for you, depending upon what it is that you have to say. And then I will gladly take the mic and take advantage of the fact that I can ask my question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. We have a microphone there and a microphone there. We are going to need to end the event at 6:30, so if you are burning with a question, I urge you to get to that microphone as soon as possible, in an orderly fashion, of course. And then finally, I just wanted to say to everyone, that what we're going to be doing here tonight is really performing what I believe, and I think many of you agree with me on this, we believe is one of a university's most important functions, and that is that we're going to be serving as a forum for discussion. And a university is a place where people come to learn, and learning requires us to challenge and be challenged by ideas. But in order to do that, those ideas need to be heard. And we all need to be given the opportunity then to apply our reason to those ideas. And so I'm going to ask everyone, whatever your views are on anything, and I mean on anything, please, let's all remember that we are an institution that is founded on the values of academic rigor, inclusion, and critical thinking. And that means that we all do need to treat one another this evening and any evening at Brandeis with the courtesy and mutual respect that really is befitting a community of scholars. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our own scholar, Professor Leibowitz.
Thank you. Thank you, Maura. Thank you not only for that introduction, but for taking the initiative to bring these two public intellectuals who hardly need an introduction here, Professors George and West, together this afternoon for a lively discussion, we believe, about liberal learning, open minds, and open debate. I can't think of a more pressing issue or a more appropriate place for this discussion than here at Brandeis and now. I want to convey special thanks, as Maura did, to alumnus Kent Lawrence for his deep commitment to Brandeis and his philanthropic support of this event, as well as his longtime support through the M.R. Bauer Foundation of our Voland Center and our summer undergraduate research fellowships. Kent, thank you again. We are all eager to hear from Professors George and West, one who occupies the right side of the political spectrum and the other who sits opposite to the left. And so I don't want to take too much time away from the main event by advancing my own points of view. But I do want to mention two things. First, after almost 2 years, and with the active engagement from many in the Brandeis community, the Board of Trustees just last month adopted 6 principles of free speech and free expression as proposed by a special task force on free expression. Those principles can be found on the Brandeis Now section of the university website and on the university president's webpage. I recommend that you read my letter introducing those principles and the principles themselves. They reflect, in my view, the purpose and historic role of the university as a place where the pursuit of knowledge is paramount and a place where ideas and opinions are freely offered, no matter how new, controversial, unpopular, or even offensive they may be. And second, as most of you know, our university motto is truth even unto its innermost parts. Our devotion to the liberal arts and to critical thinking often places uncomfortable conversations at the center of our classrooms and at the heart of our mission. This afternoon, we will hear from 2 very principled thinkers, philosophers, who fundamentally disagree with one another on many issues, but who do so with civility and mutual respect. And then I'm told, with occasional humor and abiding friendship. As Justice Brandeis argued nearly 100 years ago, the best antidote to speech with which one disagrees is not less speech, but rather more speech. So let me now welcome Cornel West and Robert George up here to the podiums to engage in speech that informs, provokes, possibly makes us somewhat uncomfortable, but hopefully wiser as well. Gentlemen, please come forward.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome. Well, thank you so much, President Leibowitz. It's a great honor. I know I speak for Cornell as well as myself in saying what an honor it is to be at this very distinguished institution. I myself am a lawyer and a professor of jurisprudence, so it's a special treat to be at a university named for one of the truly great jurists of our nation's history, Louis Brandeis. Also, I want to add my thanks, and again, I know I speak for Cornell as well as myself on this, to Maura Farley and to Kent Lawrence for helping to make this event possible. We really appreciate all the work that you and your staff put into making today possible. Finally, I want to say, and here I will speak for myself, that it is always a privilege and an honor to be in conversation with my dear brother, Cornel West. We began teaching together at Princeton in 2007. We celebrated our anniversary last year, our 10th anniversary. And I can tell you that nothing in my 34 years of teaching has been more interesting and exciting and thought-provoking and fulfilling than teaching with Brother Cornel. We have had the privilege of sitting together in small seminars, 18 students max, and discussing with them the most important issues of human existence, the fundamental issues of meaning and value, and being provoked in our conversation by the great teachers of mankind. We typically begin with Sophocles, perhaps the Antigone. We move on to dialogues from Plato, perhaps some Aristotle. We look at thinkers from across the political spectrum throughout history. We read Marx, but we read Hayek. We read Gramsci, but we read Leo Strauss. We read John Henry Newman, but John Stuart Mill as well. And it's just exhilarating to be in that context and to learn, as I have so much, from Professor West. I also want to say that part of what makes it such a privilege to appear with Cornell is there's simply nobody whose integrity I admire on any point in the political spectrum. This is simply not about politics. There is no one whose integrity I admire more than Cornel West. Cornel West is a truth seeker. I try to emulate him in that. Telling the truth as you see it, seeking the truth, knowing that it will always, to some extent, elude us, but that it's our obligation, especially as scholars, but more fundamentally as human beings, to be seeking the truth. And that's what Cornell does. And it's what he's done through his entire distinguished career. So he's been not only a friend, but a role model for me in this. And I want to thank you, my brother, for that.
I thank you, my brother.
Now, if you'll excuse me for beginning my own formal presentation autobiographically, I want to say a bit about how I came to do what I do. I grew up in the hills of West Virginia. Both of my grandfathers were coal miners. My parents had not been to college. My father was drafted out of high school, didn't complete. They did send his parents a diploma, but he was drafted out of high school in his senior year to go to Europe to fight in Normandy. So being brought up in that sort of family, education was regarded as a very important value, but mainly because it promised socioeconomic advancement. It was through education that one could rise in life. It was through education that one could move into the professional class, earn a good income, have greater status in the community. Now, by no means do I disdain or derogate those things. The opportunity to be educated and to achieve upward social mobility is a treasure. It's an important value. It's one that we would do very well as a nation to attend more carefully to and to attempt to restore and make available to more people. But what I was not brought up understanding was truth as something worth pursuing just for its own sake. Truth, knowledge, wisdom as things that one ought to pursue doggedly to its innermost parts for its inherent enrichments of ourselves as persons, as human beings. That was simply not on the radar screen for me when I went off to a liberal arts college. I went off to Swarthmore College, where an event occurred in my life that was fundamentally transformative and has shaped my belief in and my conception of liberal learning. I'm going to preach to you a little bit about it because I believe in it so deeply and because you, who are students, have the opportunity to pursue it here at Brandeis, and I hope that you will let nothing deflect you from pursuing it. And there are things, very tempting things, that can deflect you, even here at Brandeis. Cornel and I are both disciples of Plato. Plato was the guy who asked questions about everything, especially the most important things, the deepest things, the most elusive things, the fundamental questions of existence and meaning and value. Someone who never could find a way to rest content, fully content, with the answers, even the best answers. Someone who was always willing, who was driven whenever he thought he had reached a conclusion, whenever he thought he was secure, to question even that conclusion, to question the premises of everything. Not because he didn't believe there was a truth to be sought, but precisely because he wanted to know the truth and to embrace it, not simply as a set of propositions that one could affirm or deny, but to appropriate the truth, integrate it into his life as best he could. When I was a sophomore at Swarthmore, I encountered Plato for the first time in an otherwise pretty ordinary introductory course in political theory. It was a kind of Plato to NATO course. Good teacher. All of our teachers at Swarthmore, like your teachers at Brandeis, they're all very good. Dedicated to liberal arts ideals and wanting to expose us, if I can use that wonderful line from Matthew Arnold, to the best that has been thought and said. That's what liberal education is all about. And so he assigned to us Plato's dialogue, Gorgias. Now, if you know that dialogue, for those of you who do know that dialogue, of course, Plato's interlocutors are, as they almost always are, the sophists. Sophists have a very bad name. To call someone a sophist is now highly pejorative. Sophistry is not something that we should be engaging in. But the sophists were Socrates' main interlocutors. In Gorgias himself, we get a pretty nice sophist. He's not a bad guy. He's a guy who's just in the business of teaching young Athenian men, and of course it was men who were given education in ancient Athens. They were young Athenian men of a certain social class, the skills in rhetoric which would enable them to take their proper place in the community's deliberations, to have status and standing, and perhaps even celebrity, to be admired and liked and approved of. He taught people, these young men, to make arguments, to be persuasive, to win. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. It's what law professors do. But of course, he disappears from the scene rather quickly in the dialogue, and his own students and disciples pick up the debate with Socrates, and we're led by Plato to see that argument for the sake of victory, or argument simply to advance a cause that one has wrapped one's feelings and emotions around, or argument just for the sake of being somebody important or admired, is at the end of the day empty. The real purpose of argument, the real value of argument, is truth-seeking. And that's because truth has not merely instrumental value, not simply value in that it makes it possible for you to get other things, rise up the socioeconomic ladder, have standing and status, perhaps even celebrity, be looked up to, be admired, advance a cause one passionately believes in. Yes, truth can accomplish those things. Pursuit of truth, knowledge, making arguments can get you those things. But they are not what's fundamental and most important. It's truth itself considered as something intrinsically valuable, intrinsically enriching of ourselves as human beings. That's the real thing, the real good. Well, the light bulb went off over my head when I realized that everything I had believed up until that point was what was being taught by the sophists. That knowledge, even truth-seeking, had its fundamental value only instrumentally. It had never dawned on me. No one had ever told me. I'd never considered the possibility that truth-seeking, truth in itself, was what the real goal was. That truth, just for its own sake, is what really should motivate us. And not just when we're scholars. It should motivate us as human beings. I realized, in other words, that I was on the wrong side of a very, very important debate that goes all the way back to ancient Athens. And it's a debate that has never ended. And it's not a debate that pits one class or group or tribe or clan or ethnicity against another. Within virtually any group that we might consider, there are people who are on the sophist side, and then a much smaller number of people who are on Plato's side. But what I became convinced of is that I was on the wrong side, and I needed to move on to Plato's side. Little did I know the path that that would put me on. It enabled me to discover my personal vocation as a scholar. You know, growing up where I grew up, banjo in hand, literally I'm a banjo, 5-string bluegrass, but they're issued to little boys at birth in West Virginia. The farthest thing from my mind was the possibility that I would be a scholar, a professor, even a teacher. I mean, who would want to be that? I mean, if I wanted to be anything, I wanted to be a man of affairs, someone who made a difference in the world, someone who's looked up to, someone who's important. Who would want to be a teacher, a professor? But sure enough, it put me on that path. But even more importantly than the vocational path, it took me to places that I never dreamed I would go in my own thinking. Because what Plato, that old Greek, forced me to do was to think, for the first time in my life, about why I believed what I believed. I had a lot of beliefs. I suspect like you do. We all do. I had a lot of beliefs. But I had never thought about why I believed what I believed. I had never considered the premises of my beliefs. I'd never subjected them to scrutiny. I'd been in lots of arguments. I was a debater. I won prizes, things like that. I knew about arguing for victory. I knew how to do it. But I had never really examined the premises of my belief. I had adopted beliefs out of a kind of passion. They were either what I thought right-thinking people should believe, or what I was taught to believe, or what I absorbed from my ambient culture. I'd never subjected my beliefs to criticism. I didn't know why I should. Now I did. Plato forced me to do that. And guess what happens when you start to, you've all had the experience, when you start to subject your beliefs to scrutiny? You realize they don't all hold up so well. And if you really adopt the Platonic attitude, which is a lifelong project, in which you're always backsliding away from, and you need to correct yourself. But once you adopt that attitude, you're like Socrates. You're never fully content with where you are on anything. Wherever you are, your spirit is a spirit of self-criticism. You want to subject your beliefs to renewed scrutiny. You may believe in what you believe in passionately, but that little, the Greeks would have called it a daimon, sometimes translated, unfortunately, as demon. Maybe not so unfortunately. That little demon is telling you, no, no, no. No, don't get too comfortable with that belief. Don't settle in. Yes, you can act on that belief, even passionately on that belief, and you might be right, but you might be wrong. You see, the position I found myself in when I was confronted by Plato was a guy with a lot of beliefs, but there were beliefs I wasn't entitled to. Now you might say, well, of course, everyone's entitled to their beliefs. Of course you were entitled to your beliefs. And in a sense, that's right. I mean, I had a First Amendment right that the government not force me to change my beliefs. I was entitled to my beliefs in that sense. But in a more basic sense, I wasn't entitled to my beliefs because I hadn't earned them. I hadn't earned the right to believe what I believed because I had never subjected my beliefs to scrutiny. I hadn't reasoned my way to my beliefs. And so suddenly I realized, and it really was sudden, like the light bulb going off over the head, suddenly realized I've got to think my way into whatever it is I'm going to believe. And some of my beliefs changed. Not all, some remained the same, but they were all subjected to scrutiny. And that's a continuing and, as I say, lifelong project. And what that also revealed to me is the real value of liberal arts education. And here I'm going to get really preachy, because we are losing our sense of the real value of liberal arts education, even in institutions like Swarthmore and Brandeis and Princeton and Harvard that have long traditions and formal great commitments to liberal arts education. So how is liberal arts education defended today? Well, often it's not defended. Often we're willing to give up liberal arts education, even liberal arts institutions, sometimes under the pressure of economic circumstances. You know, liberal arts education is a luxury, some colleges say, we can no longer afford. You know, students demand and parents demand that we train students in vocations. We might still call ourselves a liberal arts institution, but the liberal arts departments become service departments. They're fulfilling distribution requirements. And suddenly, the majority of majors are no longer in liberal arts subjects. They're in vocational fields so that people can get jobs. I understand the economic reasons for that, but I really think that those institutions like Brandeis and Swarthmore and Princeton and Harvard that can afford to resist that should resist that, because we do have on offer something available, something far more valuable for our young people, and that is true liberal arts learning. So when liberal arts education is defended today, often it's defended in a certain sense pragmatically. So we say, for example, well, the real value of liberal arts education is that it teaches our students to be critical thinkers. And because they're critical thinkers, they're going to be able to go out and get really good jobs. If you talk to business executives, you go to the folks at Google, you go to the folks at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Microsoft, they don't want all their execs to be technically trained or have business degrees or computer science degrees. Those are all fine disciplines. If that's your major, God bless you, I have no problem with that. There's a place for it. But executives will say, we want people who have studied history, even if they didn't major in it. We want students who've studied history and philosophy and pure science and literature because they're great critical thinkers, they're creative. And look, all that's true. I'm sure it's true. I mean, every executive I talk to tells me that, right? So I have no reason to doubt it. I'm sure that's true, and it does seem to be true of liberally educated people that they're good critical thinkers. But that, in a certain sense, is also to lose track of the real value of liberal arts learning. Because, again, it instrumentalizes it. Now, it's fine. I want everybody to get a great job. Right? And if your future, if your vocation is with Google and Microsoft and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, God bless you, that's fine too. But that's not what a Brandeis education or a Swarthmore education should be giving you at the most basic and most important level. It should be teaching you to be a truth seeker. And a truth seeker about fundamental questions of existence and meaning and value. It should cause you to be wrestling with those questions all the time. It should launch you on the lifelong project of wrestling with those questions. It should make your life really uncomfortable. I love to quote Cornell, who says to our students in our courses together, the whole point of our being here with you is to unsettle you and to unsettle each other. It's unsettling. Wrestling with the great questions of meaning and value are unsettling. And when you adopt that Socratic interrogatory attitude, you do not know where you're going to end up on anything. You don't know what your views will end up being because you're going to be willing to subject your views about politics, about religion, about morality, all those great existential things, meaning, value, to question with an open mind. Now, look, it's hard to do. And it does take a couple of virtues that I think it should be the business of liberal arts institutions to inculcate, Mr. President. One of those virtues is intellectual humility. You cannot adopt the Socratic attitude if you think you're infallible. You just can't. You have to recognize your own fallibility. You have to recognize that I could be wrong, not just formally and officially. If I ask everybody in this room, could you be wrong? Everyone would raise their hand and say, of course. Notionally, we all get it. We could be wrong. Existentially, it's harder. It's harder to really have the virtue of intellectual humility, to recognize one's own fallibility, that one might be wrong even about stuff that one thinks is really, really important. So that is a virtue. And it doesn't just fall down from the heavens. How are virtues acquired? Virtues are habits. They're acquired by the practice of doing it, what Alistair McIntyre calls the practice. And institutions can foster or fail to foster that practice. And if institutions are going to be true to the liberal arts ideal, they have to foster that virtue. And there's another virtue, and that's the virtue of courage. You can't be Socratic without it. And not because someone's going to make you drink hemlock, though who knows? Who knows? The person you have to be courageous toward is yourself. It takes courage to confront the possibility that I might have to change. I might have to change what I think, what I do. And that's because there's something interesting about us human beings. We are rational, we have reason, but we also have feeling and emotion. And getting reason and feeling and emotion in the right order is part of the project. Plato talked about this quite explicitly. In fact, in one way or another, all of the great thinkers of history have talked about the importance of ordering the soul, to use Plato's language correctly, so that reason is in charge and passion and emotion are under the control of reason. The problem is that we human beings, since we're emotional, affective as well as intellectual, rational, tend to wrap our emotions more or less tightly around our convictions. We just do. And I don't care who you are, you do. And it's a challenge, therefore, to avoid falling into dogmatism. Liberal learning means open minds. I like the title that Professor Farrelly attached to today's discussion. It really does mean open minds. But to open the mind, one can't wrap the emotions too tightly around the convictions. If we wrap the emotions too tightly around the convictions, we can never unwrap. And that means we fall into dogmatism. That's the enemy of the Socratic attitude. Dogmatism. And we easily do fall into it. Now, that's not to say that we should adopt a strict Stoic attitude of trying to eliminate emotion. I say that for a principled reason. If we didn't wrap our emotions to some extent around our convictions, we would never be motivated to act for what we believe in, for our religious faith or our moral convictions or our political views or for causes that we think are just. Or even outside from those sorts of normative areas, to pursue one's vocation. If you're not pursuing your vocation passionately, whatever your vocation is, if you're not pursuing it passionately, you're probably not going to accomplish what it would be good to accomplish. So we do need that oomph that's provided by the affective aspect of ourselves as human beings. But again, we need to be careful. If we wrap too tightly, we become dogmatists. If we get it right, one of Louis Brandeis' famous interlocutors, the jurist Learned Hand, famously said that the spirit of Republican government is the spirit of not being too sure that you're right. What he said about Republican government can also be said about truth, about the intellectual mission, vocation of scholarship, for example. You know, the spirit of truth-seeking is the spirit of not being too sure that you're right. Now, that doesn't mean, again, stoicism. It doesn't mean not acting on your convictions. I mean, gosh, Brother West and I are notorious for acting on our convictions. But we don't want to fall into dogmatism. We don't want to abandon the self-critical project. And I think this is something, President Leibowitz, that institutions like Brandeis and like Swarthmore and like Princeton and like Harvard really need to keep very much in the forefront of our minds institutionally. As we're designing our programs, I was interested to hear about the new speech norms and so forth that you promulgated. They sound great. But remember why we're doing it, why you have those norms. We have similar norms at Princeton. We have them not as some abstract right, everybody gets to say what they want, everybody gets to think what they want. They're not what John Stuart Mill called an abstract right. They're ordered to a good. They're ordered to a thing worth having, and that is truth-seeking. Why do we want open minds? Why do we want freedom of speech? Why do we want conversations like these? We want them because we've got a goal that they will bring us nearer and nearer to. Never perfectly. We'll never have all the truth. We can never be too sure of anything we've got in this area. But we have these norms and convictions, and we cultivate these virtues in ourselves and in our students in order to get as close as we can to the truth, as fully as we can to the truth. Brother West and I put out a statement a little more than a year ago, I think, called Truth-Seeking, Democracy, and Freedom of Thought and Expression. And it was really a plea to people, and not just in universities, because our public civic wheel requires this as well. It was a plea to try to do business in our universities and in our public life in the proper currency of truth-seeking discourse. That is, giving reasons, providing evidence, making arguments, avoiding all the things that can lead us astray. You know, the demagoguery, the manipulation, the sliding things by, the sophistry that has always affected the human spirit. And to some extent, all of us fall into and need to then constantly be dragging ourselves back out of. But it is worth it. When we do it, we do need courage, because it means we're getting on a train not knowing the destination. We're getting on a train not knowing where we're going to be, or in a certain sense, who we're going to be when we step off the train. We may go in thinking, this is me, but at the end of the journey, or at any point along the way, think, gee, I've really changed. I've experienced a transformation. I'm not quite where I was. I might be very distant from where I was in any direction. So the liberal arts ideal, don't let it be lost. Certainly don't let it be lost at Brandeis, in the hearts of your teachers, your faculty, or in the hearts of your students. Cultivate those virtues. Organize, orient everything that we do toward those goals. Yes, it's important that our young people be properly prepared for jobs, that they have passionate convictions, that they be willing to fight for things that they believe in. But even more fundamentally than those things, they need to be truth seekers. Lifelong truth seekers. Mm-hmm. End of sermon. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Let me say that I am blessed to be here, return to Brandeis. I think it was just a year ago we were here together, though, brother, saluting the great Ambedkar, the Dalit public intellectual freedom fighter. And Brandeis is the first university to provide a space to acknowledge his tremendous witness. I want to begin by saluting my dear brother, the captain of the ship, Ron Leibowitz. We appreciate your work and witness already. Simply so, for my dear assistant professor, Mara Farrelly. Sister Yana, I don't know where she is, but I don't want to forget her. She plays a very important role indeed. But when I think of Brandeis, I think of consecrated space. I think of the time that I was able to be so deeply shaped by some of the towering figures whose presence graced this place, of Herbert Marcuse and Angela Davis, and Irving Howe, Michael Walzer, Carlos Broussard, who was head of Black Studies. We used to meet every Sunday right here at Brandeis, reading Marx and Lenin. We didn't get to Mao, though. But, it kind of held off on Stalin and Mao, the gangsters. But we were reading Marx and Lenin and Lukács and Antonio Gramsci and others. So when I think of Brandeis, I think of that kind of rich intellectual tradition. And when I return and I see my very dear brother for the first time in the flesh, who's written magisterial biographical volumes on probably the greatest prophetic figure of the barbaric 20th century from the Jewish side of town, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I'm talking about Professor Edward Kaplan. Where is Brother Kaplan? Is he? Where is he? Stand up though, brother, stand up. Stand up though. This brother's played a fundamental role in keeping alive not just liberal learning, but the rich prophetic legacy of Jerusalem and the ways in which it's intertwined with the Socratic legacy of Athens, and then on to, he writes on Martin Luther King Jr., he writes on Howard Thurman, he writes on Thomas Merton, he writes on a whole host of Dorothy Days and others, those who have set the highest levels of spiritual and moral arete, of excellence in that regard. And I would say the same thing about my dear sister, Professor Anita Hill. Just to sit here and look at her. Oh, yes. It's not just the brilliance, but that rare thing, that intangible thing called dignity, called magnanimity, standing in the midst of a storm and doing it in such a way that it's still illuminating and inspiring without bringing attention to herself, but providing a way of sustaining all of us in such bleak times. That's exactly what I see when I see my dear sister. She's Brandeis too. She's Brandeis too. She's part of Brandeis too. Then when I have my dear brother here, anytime we get together, we have a good time. That's true. We've been in the hood in Dallas together with Erykah Badu's kids in the school. You see, oh, indeed, indeed. We've been at the Air Force Academy. And you see, I'm a Christian, and therefore I always put the flag under the cross. So anytime I go into a highly patriotic space, I appreciate the flag. I appreciate the Air Force. But here comes Amos, Jeremiah, Esther, and Jesus for me. And therefore, it's always good to be with my dear brother who can help me make it through. And we had a magnificent time, didn't we?
We did indeed.
Air Force Academy. So we go to different, I mean, we've been so many other places. But the important thing is that we go as persons who love each other. I love this, brother. Love is never to be reduced to politics. Friendship is never to be reduced to whether you agree on policy. There's something called your rich humanity that allows you to revel in the personality and individuality of another person, even though I think he's wrong on a number of occasions, on a number of issues. He teaches me, I teach him. We don't lose ourselves in some homogeneous kumbaya union. No, we acknowledge our differences. We acknowledge the ways in which we might look at the world through different lenses, and yet we can still be mutually empowered and allow for our families to come together. His precious wife and children, my precious family, and to be able to play his guitar, and I sing out of tune, but I'm still singing. You see, and we've done that in class.
We have done it.
We've done that in class.
Spontaneously.
Just spontaneous, pull out his banjo. And you see, he's from the vanilla bluegrass section of America. And I'm from gut bucket, black Aretha Franklin shaping, Donny Hathaway loving, chocolate side of town. But our love and our friendship are genuine. And I say that because at this particular moment, as this empire that we live in undergoes such decay and decline, a spiritual, call it blackout or whiteout, depends on what part of town you're from, a spiritual blackout or spiritual whiteout, the eclipse of integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, the accenting of greed, manipulation, domination, conquest, all talk about power, 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 power. No, the great breakthrough of the Greeks was pytho, persuasion. Persuasion. The world comes into existence in Plato's Timaeus by means of persuasion, by means of trying to give reasons, left-wing reasons, centrist reasons, right-wing reasons, conservative reasons, liberal reasons, trying to engage in a public conversation where we can enter in such a way that we're not humiliated, we are not disrespected, but we learn how to listen to one another. We learn how to learn from one another. We learn how to be unnerved and unhoused and unsettled by one another. That is the great legacy of the best of Brandeis. 1948, hated and despised, persecuted and oppressed peoples, holding on to Hesed for dear life, holding on to steadfast love, holding on to loving kindness, still trying to spread it to the fatherless and the motherless, the vulnerable and the weak, and yet being so viciously attacked. But pogroms on the one hand and Shoah on the other, but still not allowing even that despair to have the last word. We're going to envision a university where it's Jewish in its origins and character. It is universal in its embrace of the quest for truth. But Marcuse used to say right here at Brandeis, talk about truth all you want, but a condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. To allow suffering to speak. You begin with the suffering of those you love in your own family, your own community, your own group, and it spills over the suffering of all of humanity, even the suffering of sentient beings, all of the kinds of sufferings that drove Nietzsche mad. The pain, the cruelty, the domination, the oppression, the subjugation. So when we're talking about liberal learning, this is not some abstract construct of a bureaucrat in a professional managerial site called a university trying to preserve itself. We're talking about the best of the species. Because most of our history has been a history of hatred and envy and contempt and domination. And democracies are simply these disruptions, trying to create spaces in which maybe you can arrest the hatred, arrest the contempt, arrest the domination, arrest this exploitation, and provide individually and existentially spaces in which there is kindness and gentleness, and larger spaces where there's justice and rule of law, but a rule of law that does not hide and conceal the various arbitrary uses of power in its own name. Because I come from a people who've been terrorized for 400 years in the name of rule of law, and yet we still teach the world so much about freedom. Frederick Douglass was no joke. Sojourner Truth was no joke. People who've been traumatized for 400 years teach the world so much about healing in the music, in the arts, in the friendships. Hated for 400 years and teach the world so much about love and how to love. Brother Robbie and I just turn on Love Supreme. John Coltrane. I listened to a little Stevie Wonder, Love and the Need of Love. You see, those are love warriors. And that's precisely what at the human level, at the deep level of love and friendship brings us together as we wrestle with the role of the market vis-a-vis larger society. I am a revolutionary Christian. He is a Christian. You see, disciples of Plato, we are close followers of a Jew named Jesus. There's no Jesus without prophetic Judaism. My Christianity is a rich footnote to prophetic Judaism. Rich footnote. Very rich. But there's no footnote without that rich infrastructure that's in place. You see. But at the same time, we wrestle with same-sex marriage. We wrestle with abortion. We wrestle with a whole host of issues. We come together on a variety of different issues. We're fighting against poverty. We're defending religious liberty. We are defending freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. Rush Limbaugh has a right to be thoroughly wrong. I defend that right. And it's not just it's utilitarian because I want my right. No, because to create a context in which people are able to enter public space and be able to be vulnerable enough to follow the Negro national anthem of a hated people, but love driven at our best. Lift every voice. And that lift every voice doesn't mean it has to be filtered. It has to be checked. No, lift your voice. Find out who you are. But at the same time, like a jazz musician or a blues artist, you better find your voice. Don't be an echo. Don't be a copy. Be an original. Don't be a simulacra or a semblance. Be what Ashford and Simpson called the real thing. What I love about this brother, he is the real thing as a conservative brother. You see, which means, like Malcolm X, he says what he means what he says. That's very important. I got a whole lot of liberal and neoliberal friends who I love dearly, but they don't say what they mean and mean what they say. No, too many of them like to say one thing, do something else. Act as if somehow they're in solidarity, but when it's time to show up, they got to go to a tea party. I'm not talking to anybody in this room, but I'm just talking about there are some. Liberals and neoliberals. That's one of the reasons why I get in trouble so much with my liberals and Democratic Party folk, you see. Yeah. Because it's a question of, are you going to be honest with yourself and echo that line 24a of Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth the living. And then that line 24a, the cause of my unpopularity is parrhesia, P-A-R-R-H-E-S-I-A, frank speech, plain speech, unintimidated speech, fearless speech. Again, that's what we love about Brother Malcolm, our Muslim brother. Malcolm engaged in frank speech. When he said white brothers and sisters are devils, he meant it. He changed his mind. I was wrong. They're not devils. Many of them engage in devilish behavior, but they're not devils. He said it again. I was wrong. I meant it. That's the kind of product of paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, of deep education, not cheap schooling. You see. Now, Malcolm got paideia in Norfolk State Prison. Some folk are lucky to go to Brandeis. James Baldwin used to say, I didn't go to college, but a college went through me. When Brandeis students graduate, it's not going to be a question of whether you went to Brandeis. Did the best of Brandeis go through you? Because if the best of Brandeis went through you, you were not just unsettled, but you learned how to die. And that's what we also tell our students. I just told my students just last week in my lecture on Nietzsche at Harvard, I'm so glad you all showed up to learn how to die. Because you have to learn how to die in order to learn how to live. And to learn how to die is to critically examine your assumptions and presuppositions. And when you give some of them up, that's a form of death. And there is no life without death. There is no maturity, no growth, no development without giving up certain dogmas, giving up certain doctrines, giving up certain assumptions, giving up certain presuppositions. And that process of learning how to die in order to learn how to live well is crucial. It's fundamental, not just for our development as human beings, but for any possibility of freedom and democracy. Not just the names freedom and democracy, the actual concrete practice of it to produce democratic personalities, democratic soul crafts. See, the dominant soul craft these days is neoliberal soul craft. It's about being smart, it's being rich, and when you have foreign policy challenges, dropping bombs. And one of the things we know about smartness is what? Gangsters could be smart, Nazis can be smart, white supremacists can be smart, misogynists can be smart, homophobes can be smart. But when you really cut deeper and allow for that compassion and wisdom to play a role, then you're not just impressed by the smartest person in the room. Let the phones be smart. You better be something deeper. And that deeper is precisely what the best of liberal learning is all about, which is this formation of attention. What are you attending to? Superficial things or substantive things? Status, power, honor, integrity, honesty, decency. It's about the cultivation of a critical self, acknowledging no one of us have any possession of truth, capital T, goodness, capital G, beauty, capital B. And I'm a Christian, so I include the holy, God. Or if you're polytheistic, gods. You see. No one of us as fallen, fallible human beings have access to full possession of those. That's that intellectual humility that Brother Robbie is rightly talking about. But if we confuse attending to the things that matter, Simone Weil had a beautiful notion of the formation of attention as a form, the fundamental form of education. And these days, who gets the attention of most of our fellow citizens across generation? It's not the best, it's not the wisest, it's not the most loving. It's those obsessed with either the money making, the getting over, or the obsession with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. Pretty pervasive, not just on the business page, but you can start there. It's in every institution, mosques, synagogues, church, trade union, right across the board. You see. That's the spiritual blackout that we're talking about. But that last pillar, and we're going to go back and forth and open it up, has to do with the maturation of a compassionate soul. The maturation of a compassionate soul. Because maturity is something that doesn't come by means of osmosis. You got to fight for it. Goethe says he had to reconquer himself every day. That's Faust. He's right. How do you become a mature person so that you're able to step into ambiguity, step into the inconclusive, step into the ineffable, and still be able to stand with a vision and a conviction that you're willing to live for and maybe even die for? That's what I appreciated about the Air Force folk, because they're ready to die. They don't have a commercial spirit. They have a martial spirit. William James wrote that last essay, next last essay before he died, called The Moral Equivalent of War. He said, how do you create folk who have a martial spirit, having the courage to love and courage to hope and courage to think critically for themselves? You can't sustain a democracy without it. And that's one of the reasons why we're spinning, sliding down a slope of chaos and hatred and contempt. And it's not just Brother Trump. Trump or brother? Yeah, that's right. He is my brother. He's a gangster, but he's also a brother. When I say gangster, that's an objective condition. It's not a subjective expression. Grabbing women's private parts, that's gangster. You see somebody got oil, it's not yours, and you want it, that's gangster. And that's just the beginning of it. But you don't fetishize any person because there's a gangster inside of all of us. Shot across the board. I learned it in Vacation Bible School. We call it charitable Christian hatred. You hate the sin and try to love the sinner. You hate the injustice and still try to stay in contact with the humanity of those who perpetuate the injustice. That's Martin Luther King Jr. That's Nina Simone. That's Stevie Wonder. That's Aretha Franklin. That's Irene West and Clifton West, my parents. Shiloh Baptist Church. That's the tradition that shaped souls and minds and hearts to undergo a paideia, to try to provide some exemplary behavior, always falling short. And Beckett is right. You try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. That's the story of our lives. Nobody fully approximates any grand ideal. But it's the effort. Once you give up on the effort, you give up on any quest for truth, goodness, beauty. You give up on your democratic project, and it becomes just a matter of the survival, not just of the so-called fittest in the Darwinian sense, but a survival of the slickest in the market-driven culture in which we find ourselves. And that's what brings tears to one's eyes. That's why to talk about liberal learning is not some kind of issue of polarization of constituencies that have to come up with skills to learn how to relate to one another. That's a small part of it. But what's at the deeper level is that with ecological catastrophe coming our way, with escalating possibilities of war, with wealth inequalities, with hatred of different peoples, of sexual orientation, of ethnicity, religion, and races, we're talking about the species itself going under. Everything is at stake. And that's one of the reasons why we're blessed to be here at Brandeis. We appreciate you all having us. And I'm going to hand it back over to my dear brother. I know we should talk about something we disagree with. Is that what you wanted us to do? I'm following you. I'm following you there. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I have to tell a couple of stories on Cornell. I'm sure you were as moved as I was. I've heard it many times, but I'm always moved when Cornell rightly describes a true education, a deep education, paideia, a liberal education, as learning how to die. Well, once when I heard that speech, it was in our class, in our seminar. Now, the way we structure our seminars, the first half, Cornell and I go back and forth with each other about the text. A Platonic dialogue, Marx, Hayek, Gramsci, Dewey, C.S. Lewis, whoever it is. And then we have a break, and then we come back for the general class discussion. Well, on one occasion, Cornell ended that first half with that speech about why we are here, why we're doing what we're doing, why you are at this university, what a liberal education is about. You know, it's about learning how to die. And that's what you need to be devoting yourself to, learning how to die. And that ended the first half, and we went to our break. You could hear a pin drop. And then gradually students got up, and we went over to the coffee. And I was getting a cup of coffee, and one of our students was there, and I said, "That was powerful." And the student said, "How am I going to explain it to my parents?" I suppose they wanted him to be an investment manager. They thought that's why they were sending him. But it's oh so true. It's oh so true. A deep education, paideia, causes what Nietzsche would call a transvaluation of values. You know, we learn in deep education to relativize the things that even our well-intentioned people who love us most tell us to focus on. Getting ahead, getting a good career, high-paying job, improving social standing, being somebody who matters, being somebody who's looked up to, having high social status, even being a celebrity. All that gets relativized by paideia. It's really about learning how to die, which is Cornell's way of saying it's about engaging those most fundamental questions, those questions of existence and meaning and value. The other story is this. In 2016, I had the privilege of being elected chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. It's a wonderful federal government agency, much neglected, tiny budget, but it fights the fight within the government, within any government. It's the gadfly within any administration. At the time, it happened to be Obama administration. But it's the gadfly in any administration on behalf of international religious freedom, on behalf of prisoners of conscience, on behalf of persecuted religious minorities and other people who are persecuted for their beliefs. So when I was elected chairman, I needed to be sworn in. So I arranged with Chief Justice Roberts to swear me in at the Supreme Court of the United States, and I asked Cornel if he would come along with me and hold Bible, which he very, very generously and graciously and kindly agreed to do. We got in touch with Harriet Tubman House up in Auburn, New York, and asked if we could borrow Harriet Tubman's Bible, because I wanted to be sworn in on the Bible of a true human rights hero. And they were so kind, they were so wonderful people, wonderful people.
That's true.
And they FedExed the Bible, which was about as big as this table, down to us. I don't know how you place an insurance value on Harriet Tubman's Bible. But there we were with Harriet Tubman's great big Bible.
That's right.
And we were walking up the steps to the Supreme Court to visit the Chief Justice in his chambers for the oath taking. And as we're walking in together, I see Cornel catch the eye of one of the police officers guarding the court. And Cornel gives him a look, and the officer gives him a look, and then we walk on. I couldn't figure out what that was all about, so I said, Brother Cornel, what was that all about between you and the police officer? And he said, well, a couple of weeks ago I was here, but I was here for a protest, and that guy arrested me.
That's true.
This time he was heading into the Chief Justice's chambers. And then he said to me, he said, you know, Brother Robbie, now that I think of it, I've actually never been to the Supreme Court except to be arrested.
That's true. That's true.
Well, one of the things that Cornel and I wrestle with, now we're not at extremes, although that might be suggested by some of our formal affiliations. Cornel, as you may know, is honorary chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I'm a conservative. One of the things we wrestle about is the place of the market.
That's right.
And if you're going to have a market, you're going to have inequality. That's just going to happen. If you have a free market, basically free market system. Now, I'm not a laissez-faire libertarian. I think there are legitimate reasons to regulate the market. But I believe in a basically free market, and I believe in that for a number of reasons, including I think that the market is a wonderful mechanism for lifting people out of poverty, for dispersing power, for making sure there's not too much power in the hands of the government without countervailing authority structures. There are various reasons that I have that would be familiar to conservatives and libertarians for why we favor the market. But I do believe in the market. Cornel, I'll let you speak for yourself, but when we've had these debates, Brother Cornel is a bit more skeptical. I would say a good bit more skeptical than I am about the magic of the market to lift people out of poverty and create centers of power that are alternatives to the government and help to keep government in check and so forth. And he's very worried about the inequalities, especially the gross inequalities. Now, at the same time, even though he's honorary chairman of Democratic Socialists of America, he doesn't want to abolish the market or do away with the market or do away with private property or ownership. If you look at the Communist Manifesto, which we have taught together, Cornel's not all in with that because he's concerned that if you try to get perfect equality, if you do have a government takeover of the means of production, what you'll get pretty quickly is tyranny. So the ideal should be wealth or income equality, but we need to realize we can't get to that ideal without taking risks that are too great to other important values. So the market, from Cornel's point of view, is a sort of lesser evil. I see it as a positive good. He sees it as a lesser evil. But that's a question that we wrestle with. Now, I don't see inequality just as such as any kind of a problem. I have no problem at all with that kind. Now, we share the belief that the basic equality and dignity of all members of the human family is important. and that with respect to governmental policy, and even us as individuals, we should treat people with equal concern and respect, to use that phrase from the late Ronald Dworkin. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about income inequality, wealth inequality, and what steps ought to be taken to ameliorate those inequalities if, in fact, they should be ameliorated. Now, to the extent, and it's a significant extent in most developed societies, that inequalities themselves are reflective of injustices, so then sure. But it's the injustice that I'm concerned about, not the inequality. There's a different view there. And Cornel makes me think, maybe I should be worried about those inequalities, especially when you have some people who are worth, what's Bill Gates' net worth, not Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos' net worth today? It's beyond imagining. I mean, I used to think it was impressive when people like Gates and Buffett had 60 billion. Well, I think Bezos has blasted his way through that. I don't know, does anybody happen to know what the latest is? 100 billion or 180 billion or whatever it is? It's beyond imagining, and some people are suffering. Now, we agree people ought not to be suffering. So we agree that things need to be done for the poor. Now, we also have a disagreement about exactly what to do. We both believe that there needs to be private assistance to the poor. As a matter of fact, we both believe that there needs to be a governmental safety net, and we can't rely entirely on the institutions of civil society. But within those boundaries, we do have disagreements. Cornel has more, just as I have more faith in markets than he does, he has more faith in government programs than I do. I looked at things like, we were talking about this in Professor Farrelly's class today, the faith-based initiative. I'd like to see more money in the hands of private and faith-based providers, which I believe, could be wrong, it's possible that I'm wrong about this, but I believe, based on my experience, especially in Appalachia, that those providers are more effective. Their problem is a lack of resources. Government programs, as far as I can tell, tend to be, not every case, but tend to be less effective and more wasteful. So, since I believe in social mobility, since I want people at the bottom end to be cared for, I'm looking for ways to invigorate and empower institutions of civil society to do that fundamental health, education, and welfare work. Acknowledging that you can't rely on it entirely, that there has to be a social safety net. So in a certain sense, we do have serious disagreements about this. They matter. We might vote for different candidates based on considerations like that. But notice that neither of us is at extremes. He's not going to abolish private property or try to enforce wealth equality. I'm not going to embrace laissez-faire, Randian, libertarian views, where the belief that, that any outcome that the market produces is by definition just because it's the outcome that the market produced. But Cornel, you should talk a bit about that.
No, indeed, because I think the, well, one, after your masterful lecture in Professor Farley's class, talking about separation of powers and the mechanisms of accountability when it comes to government, when it comes to public power, I want that same focus on the accountability of concentration of power in the market. Oligarchs, plutocrats, those at the top who have very little public accountability, able to engage in tax evasion, able to come up with ingenious ways of resisting the pull to public good. Now, many of them have high philanthropic profiles, and that's a beautiful thing. But charity is not the same as justice. See, it's a beautiful thing for the cash to flow from the top, but we're talking about qua-citizen. Citizen has to do with public interest, public good, not private marketeer who then is kind enough to give money. And of course, we have a long history of that in the United States, from Carnegie and Rockefeller and Roosevelt, a whole host of others. Very kind private marketeers who gave big money for wonderful causes. So you don't downplay that, but you don't allow that to be a substitute for commitment to public good. So I push Brother Robin, we go at this on and on and on in between him playing his guitar and me singing, that I do have a deep suspicion of public power. And I have to. I come from a minority who had to deal with the tyranny of the majority. We exemplify what de Tocqueville talked about in terms of the tyranny of the majority, right? If we had to wait for white brothers and sisters to vote for black people to be emancipated from slavery, should me and Sister Anita and others be on the move this very moment, because we still have some challenges. See, that was over against, that was counter-majoritarian. So was Brown v. Board. So was a whole host of movements that were enhancing for the vulnerable. So we had to be very improvisational about this. We can't be dogmatic about this. You see, I have a deep suspicion of government. I have a deep suspicion of the rule of law in the courts, even though I'm committed to rule of law. I'm committed to counter-majoritarian institutions protecting the liberties that are the preconditions of democratic practices. But they haven't been too good at it over time. We've had some breakthroughs, but haven't been too good at it. But we're still committed to it. In the same way, when Robbie then comes and says that we've got to come to terms with some market-driven solutions to deal with poverty. You got 1 out of 2 children under 6, black and brown in America, living in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. We both agree that's morally obscene. That's spiritually empty. Where's the priority? And that's what I liked about Brother Bernie Sanders. Bernie said, I'm going after big business. How many politicians have the courage to do that? Usually because they need big business to even become politicians who think they can win. Bernie said, I don't give a damn. I said, Brother Bernie, I'm going with you. Oh, we going down together. Do I agree with everything with Bernie? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He's got Eugene Debs on his wall. Eugene Debs was a great man, but I got Martin King. I got Fannie Lou Hamer. It's a different tradition, but we overlap in a magnificent way. And I'm just giving examples of both the overlap, but also some of the deep differences that we have. And that does not prevent us, though, from personally coming together and going into poor communities, and Robbie giving very, very powerful lectures on Paideia to young black kids and young poor kids. And the same with myself in terms of other contexts, but being true to ourselves. I mean, that's the important thing. I don't think you can have a deep friendship and a deep love connection without being true to yourself and being open and vulnerable enough that you're able to reveal your agreements and your disagreements.
Cornel has raised an issue that I think is not discussed enough. And the reason it's not discussed enough is really both parties and both sides in our own politics have reasons not to discuss it. And that's the problem of plutocracy. Plutocracy. Mm-hmm. On the conservative side, the temptation is not to acknowledge there's a problem there, that there can be private power that is so immunized from accountability.
That's right.
And that is so large that it functions as public power. And it can influence the public wheel in ways that undermine the interests and choices and will of the democratic republic. On the left, the problem is not acknowledging that plutocracy is a problem. Folks on the left will acknowledge that all day. Doing something about it, when you're involved in it big time, when you like what plutocracy is doing for you or for your causes, that's another story. But I think that's an area where people on the left and the right who are people of principle can, despite their disagreements, actually come together and to begin by saying, look at the emperor. Look at what no one else wants to look at. Look at the problem of plutocracy and look at how widespread it is. Yeah, Mara, go ahead. Yeah.
Jump in, because we've got about 10 minutes. I could listen to you all evening, but I do want to try and get a couple of questions in from the audience. So why don't we've got 10 minutes. I'm going to take one from this microphone and one, like, don't knock each other down as you're trying to get to the microphone.
We can take some more time if you like, because we're in no rush.
No, we've got a dinner.
We've got a dinner.
Yeah. Oh, we got dinner. Oh,
so I'm actually, so first of all, this is Mr. Roland Blanding over here. Yes.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Hi everyone, my name is Roland Blanding. I'm a sophomore here, econ and philosophy major. I was a part of Professor Farrelly's supper club last semester. Best time of my life. I want to thank Professor George and Professor West for coming here in the first place. And Professor West, actually had a question specifically for you. So one of the readings that we had in a class I took with Professor Fairley was your book, Race Matters. And you talk about the different types of black leaders. And of the three categories, I specifically remember self-effacing leaders and transcendent leaders. And the question that was sort of engendered in me back then that I still carry now is, what type of leader do you think that you are? Is this the type of leader that you wanted to be when you started? And what can I do to become a transcendent leader, not just a transcendent black leader?
Good. Beautiful question, beautiful question. One, though, I don't consider myself a leader because I don't have an organization, I don't have an infrastructure. I'm a lone ranger. I go in and out of different organizations, groups, movements, and so forth. But as a revolutionary Christian, I'm in the world, but not of it. And that means that you have to wear it, in some sense, wear it like a loose garment. You can't be subsumed under their dogmas, assumed under their auspices, as it were. So you're actually intervening with whatever power, authenticity, and for realness you have. But you're not a leader in that sense. You're simply a person who's trying to bear witness. You see, we Christians in the world, we're just trying to bear witness with works of love that ought to be shaped by sincere self-renunciation and driven by love with no call for any overarching applause. Now, the applause is nice, but you don't allow the popularity to trump your integrity. You see. So against Obama, against whoever it is, if I'm telling the truth in the Middle East, if I want to tell the truth, I'm going to tell the truth regardless of the popularity and just hope I don't get shot the next night. You know what I mean? You got character assassination, you got literal assassination. So in that sense, it'd be closer to the legacy of Martin King. Where's Brother Kaplan? He understands what I'm talking about. That's what Heschel's about. That's what Dorothy Day is about. You see, they weren't persons who were somehow connected to any one organization. They're parts of tradition, absolutely, but not any organization. For me, a leader is somebody who has an organization. Brother Ron is a leader of Brandeis. I don't have a Brandeis. You see what I mean? I just have myself. I'm a jazz man. I got my voice, I got my instrument, I got my partners, my companions, and then my political comrades, many of whom I might disagree with, some of whom might be spiritually vacuous, and I tell them so. I just agree with them on policy. But they're not the kind of folks I want to be in a foxhole with. This brother, each time I go to jail, he's the first one to call to pay my bail. And I said, oh, what happened? Where's my leftist comrades? Well, you know, we're glad you're in there. We appreciate it. Wonderful thing you're doing. I need to get out. Okay, Brother Robbie's got cash. But see, that's a different kind of connection. You see what I mean? I'm sorry to go on, but I appreciate that question, though.
All right, and if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Srinivas. I'm a postdoc at Brandeis. And I really, really liked the description of the world that both the speakers illustrated, this world where we can talk to people we disagree with in a respectful way and resolve our differences in this way. And I really, really wish that I lived in such a world, but I don't. As a millennial, I live in a world, honestly, where the society is teetering on the brink of fascism, and it seems that there are these power structures that are really entrenched, that are doing a lot of violence to a lot of people, and it seems very unfair to ask the people at the very bottom to be civil to the people who are oppressing them.
It's a powerful question, my brother. Very powerful question. And there's a difference between being respectful of others as opposed to being civil that has deferential implications. There's ways of being respectful that are civil. There's ways that are being civil that are differential. We're not asking any oppressed people to be deferential. We're not asking for any oppressed people not to raise their voices and puncture the lies and mendacity that's being put forward that reproduces their suffering. But we are asking all persons, especially those who've been dehumanized, to stay in contact with the humanity of others, because you know precisely what it's like to experience dehumanization. And you don't want anybody to experience that. Now, that's a spiritual jump. That's a moral jump. We must keep a stress on the moral and spiritual dimensions of the kind of persons we are and are becoming in our movements. This is not a utilitarian calculus. This is not a manipulative strategy of just winning. It's the process of being decent and having integrity, and that's the conception of deep civility that I think all oppressed people must have. Because if all you want to do if you're oppressed is end up oppressing others, if all you want to do if you're not being treated civilly is to give incivility back, if all you want to do if you're being hated is to give hatred back, then in fact that just increases the hate, the incivility, and so forth. You see the point that I'm asking? And it's a very important discussion, and I'm so glad you raised that question, because many of my leftist comrades, you know, they Brother West, how come you engage with dialogues with different kinds of persons and so forth? You got to draw the line. This is a question of power. I say, yes, it is a question of power. I'm not naive in economic and political power, but there's something called moral and spiritual power, too. And in the end, when the worms get your body, when your grandmama got to make her assessment of how you live your life from the grave, she's not going to be looking just on how you deploy political and economic power. She wants to know what kind of human being you were through time and space from your mama's womb to tomb. And that's the level of the best of oppressed peoples. It's the best of the history of Jewish resistance. Best of the history of Irish resistance against British imperialism. The best of all peoples who are trying to come to terms with various mechanisms of oppression and so forth. And that's my own tradition too, in terms of Fannie Lou and Martin and the others.
The only thing I would add to what Professor West said is that we tend in this country to sort ourselves out into communities of like-mindedness, where we end up associating with and talking with and developing relationships with people who basically see the world as we do. It's now even gotten to the point, and this is the other side of a blessing, it's a blessing that we have so many sources of news and commentary, not only the internet, but even television. When Brother West and I were young in the Middle Ages, there were 4 channels on TV, you know, 4 networks, and that was it. And there were 3 newspapers, basically, 3 national newspapers. Well, the other side of that blessing is it's now possible for those of one political persuasion to read only these papers, watch only these news channels, go to only these websites, and those of that particular opposite persuasion to go there, and everybody in between can find a niche for themselves. And even regionally, we sort ourselves out, or even in institutions. It's really important for everyone to find people you have very fundamental disagreements with and develop relationships with them.
Absolutely.
Try to understand where they're coming from. Consider the possibility that they might be right on some things, that you might be wrong on some things. That doesn't mean you don't have convictions. That doesn't mean you throw away your convictions. That doesn't mean you don't act. But you do need to be willing to listen, and you need to get to know people. And if we have a problem where we're in institutions where, at least on the fundamentals, pretty much everybody is in agreement, then we're being deprived of the opportunities to be challenged by people who do think differently than we do. If Brandeis University or Princeton University or Harvard, Swarthmore is not challenging you, is not creating opportunities where you do interact with people who disagree with you, or hear speakers, or have professors who are challenging some of your fundamental beliefs, then it's not doing you the service it's meant to be doing. It's not providing you with paideia, with a true liberal education. But whether or not, whatever the institutional impediments are because of region or the communities that you happen to be in and so forth, take the affirmative responsibility to find opportunities to interact with people who will challenge, who will unsettle us.
It's 6:30. I think that's actually a great note for us to end on. So I thank you. That's all I can say.
And that was wonderful.